Hey guys, let's take a look at this chapter. But before we do, I need you to understand that some of your notes have not been so fantastic. Some of them have just been copies of exactly what you see here, and then hidden someplace in there is some kind of highlight that maybe you did, or maybe you typed a little more information past this. And so if you're looking at, hey, I got low scores on that, that's why. Now, I have been pretty lenient on it, so your scores are better than what I would have given you, which is like at 10%, but I've had quite a few people actually doing that. And that really foregoes the whole reason for having you take notes. You taking notes is about trying to remember what you're being taught. It's not about trying to fulfill some, hoop that you got to jump through. And so in any case, actually take notes and turn them in. You'll actually get a higher score for taking your own original notes than just copying stuff straight out of these presentations and then writing something down. Because I'm not searching through it, right? I'm not looking through your information and go, oh, gee, they added a little something right here. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to look at it and go, wow, that looks like it's straight from the presentation. I should give them a 0, right? So take your notes well. All right, so let's talk about storage. Now we're going to cover a bunch of practical things, and that's going to happen in class. So when it's time to do the lab, I'll show you a bunch of stuff. We'll boot from some things and show you how to use something. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to expect you to take notes on that, and I'll remind you on that day, like, hey, write down notes on this. And that's not just because I want you to remember that, because honestly, when you're looking at a program and somebody's clicking on stuff, it's hard to remember all that. But I want it there so you can refer to it. Throughout the storage lab, you're going to do some stuff, right? You're going to get in there and get some stuff done. And the problem that happens on this particular assignment is people are like, how do you do that? Where did you click there? That kind of thing. So not only are you trying to grasp the principles of what we're doing, you're also trying to figure out how do I make the program do that kind of thing. So there'll be quite a bit of information that I'm going to give you prior to us actually doing lab on that day. But today, that's why this one's a little shorter, because today is stuff that we haven't covered. It's stuff about, sizes and shapes and technicalities of this kind of thing. So let's get going. Hard disk drives. So you're dealing with a hard disk inside that drive, and it's coated with metallic, and I'm sorry I don't have one here with me. But they come in these various sizes for computers. So the size of a laptop computer is a 2.5-inch drive that slides in there. So if you were to say, I'm going to replace, my hard drive in my laptop, then that's what you're looking for. You'll also notice that a 1.8 size for a low-end laptop and sometimes other equipment. In other words, it's even thinner. It's very important to know which one you're looking for. You may think, well, it's not going to matter. Well, obviously the 2.5 is not going to fit in a 1.8 space. A 1.8 will fit in a 2.5 space, but now it's going to be flopping around in there. It won't mount correctly. You don't want that to happen. As a matter of fact, I worked on a friend's computer, and where he would rest his hand right there on the computer, bad design. I won't say what company it was. That was right where the hard drive was, and the connection was just a little loose, and you get these weird, freaky errors. And it took me a bit of time to figure that one out, right? Because, I just redid the drive and I did the things that they needed to do. And then they said, hey, the problem's still happening. And then I opened it up, right? And I'm like, holy crap, the hard drive is right underneath the touchpad. And he had his son work on his computer a couple of years prior, and one of those screws was not in tight enough, and that little tiny ribbon that they had was moving around on that connector and causing them issues. That's what it was. In any case, 3.5 and this is inches, is the size for desktops. So they're bigger. And so bigger size usually is cheaper. All right, and then we have the solid state drives, and there's different ways to do solid state. So I'm actually going to pull up here This is Sony Palm. That's what something else, right? I was doing a different video. Let's look at M2 SSD. So SSD stands for solid state drive. That's what it stands for. And this is a good picture. I like Crucial. So let's go to Crucial site here. Oh, that's straight off a Newegg. Oh, there you go. There it is. So this is a very tiny drive, and this connector at the end is a standard connector. It's a standard M2 connector that some of the newer boards will have. And this SATA, this M2 SATA SSD, so that is a SATA a standard. That's what I should say, right? So we're looking at the end of that, and that's not quite a SATA hookup that we would see on the back of a drive. No, it's particular. But these are cheaper to buy, much cheaper, and they are faster. And so if you have a port on your board that's an M.2 port, then you can get a storage device, an SSD, that fits right in that thing, and it usually has a little tiny screw right there where that notch is, right here, and that screw holds it down in place. And again, better for heat, cheaper for you to buy, super fast. It's as fast as you can get these days. It's fantastic stuff. M2. And most boards these days come with that, but that's just another type of SSD. So they also make the SSDs that, of course, you plug into a USB port, or are special for your camera, or a little tiny one for your phone. And then, of course, SSDs that actually come in the SATA format. So it's a 2.5 looking drive, which is what we use in class. That's what you've gotten to use, was this SSD. SSD is also called NAND flash. You can look up NAND. There's NAND. There's such tons of information on that. And none of this is a new technology, right? We see it as new because now it's affecting our life, but they had this stuff back in the 80s. It was just more expensive than the other options. And the memory storage, of course, wasn't as high. And so you could, the memory storage on a hard disk kept climbing and climbing and climbing, where on SSD it was kind of just stagnant. It costs a lot, and you didn't get much for that. And so once they really started getting into how could we make this work better, then boy, we started to see some good stuff happen. All right, so the mechanical hard disk drives, they usually will have 1, 2, or more platters inside, and those platters will have arms on each one of them. And so let me actually pull up a picture of how a hard disk drive works. Inside. Get to hear my typing. All right, so there's some images here, a lot of them. That's a pretty good one. That one's actually, this is a stylish one. Ooh, it's got different colors. But you can actually see the arms right here, right? These actuating arms. And this is the little tiny head that reads, and it looks like it's touching the disk, but it isn't. It's really, really close. And there's a head here for this side of the platter and one for underneath. That's what you're seeing here. Now this one would have 2 on it, one for the underneath part, should put it like that, and one for the top. So I did that backwards. But anyway, one for this underneath top portion, one for the top underneath, and it would continue to do that. Now this last one, I've noticed sometimes they won't have one underneath that. And so that's a difference. I mean, some of the drives out there, you go, this is a 750, and then this is a terabyte. And then if you opened it, you'd find out, wow, this is actually just a terabyte drive, but they didn't put another reading arm on there. So they don't have that little head on there. Cool thing is this over here is a huge magnet. And I've been thinking about whether or not we should do this in class this semester, because I've got some old hard drives and just take them apart so you can see how they work. It's pretty cool. In any case, this is a big magnet, right? And this is magnetic storage, but these magnets don't deal with the magnetic flux that's happening over here. And because they are setting next to the disk, they're not on top of the disk, they don't interfere with what is on the disk. Instead, what this is used for is to actuate the arm. So there's not actually a physical gear moving that arm back and forth. They flux this magnet, and so more magnetized this side, less this side, and it moves it precisely across the surface of this disc, that's just fantastic. To me, that's just cool stuff right there. That's really cool. And so that's what these magnets are for, and they're very, very strong magnets, and they move those arms back and forth to read the data. And we've talked about how that data is stored. All right, so anyway, there's a couple of things you should know about. For instance, stacking those together and spinning those inside the metal housing together, so all of those disks spinning together, creates a three-dimensional volume of a disk. So you're really writing information or reading information down and up this way, right? In these cylinder type situations. And as a matter of fact, that's what they call it. So when they separate out a drive, which we'll look at in a minute, you basically have a track that runs around the surface of this. And then those tracks are divided into different sectors. And then there actually is what they call a volume. So those sectors would create a volume coming down this way. Let's see if we can find a graphic for that. HDD volume, not a volume label. So we may not be able to find an image of this. They used to include these in all the books back in the day, but they don't do it too much anymore. Ah, there it is. So I should have looked at the other. So anyway, this is how you have a drive format, and you got all these different little sectors. And so when you realize that you've got the front part of the platter, the underside, the front, or I should say top, under, top, under, top, under. So you're going down this way. Then these sectors, right, go all the way down. So for the computer, it's like it's all one thing going up and down. Anyway, I'm getting off track, really. You don't need to know too much of that. I just think it's cool. There is a firmware. In other words, right, there's a piece of software stuck into a chip, and that firmware controls how the data reading and writing happens and the motherboard communication. And so on the motherboard, you'll usually have a chip that controls that communication. And then you'll have the chips that are all on the underside of a hard drive that also control how quickly that data can get in and out and whether it needs to go to cache and all that stuff. Most current drives use a 4096 byte in a sector, and we talked about that. Remember, we jumped ahead and talked about how that's creating those little sectors. How big is that sector going to be? If you create it too big and then only use half of it, you still use the whole sector, that kind of thing. And of course, there's SSDs. They got it sitting on one of these platters, but there's an SSD. That's what it looks like inside. You got these memory chips in there. And that's what we already talked about. And one sector and one track right there for you. Oops. All right, so there is something called low-level formatting, and a lot of people get this confused, and they think that they low-level format their hard disks, and they don't. Low-level formatting these days happens at the factory. Now, you can low-level format a hard drive. You have to have special tools to do it, and usually those tools are provided by the hard drive maker themselves. So in other words, you don't use a Seagate low-level format for your Western Digital, that kind of thing. And I have some tools. We'll look at some tools, and I'll actually mention this. Hey, there's the low-level formatting right there. Takes a long time. It's not the same as the high-level formatting that we do within the operating system. That does sometimes take a long time, but takes a lot less time than a low-level. Then, of course, you got the firmware of the hard drive. You got the UEFI BIOS, which recognizes and talks to the firmware and says, okay, I see you as a storage device. And then, of course, the OS that recognizes what's happening between these two. And then there's a logical block addressing, an LBA, to address hard drive sectors. You should also be aware that there's a technology known as self-monitoring analysis and reporting technology, SMART, that almost every single hard drive these days includes. And that is just reporting to say, hey, I think I've seen a problem with myself, to give you an advanced warning. So often you never see it, you know, because we often just don't have trouble with hard disks. That's the honest truth. And so you often don't see any reporting from it. But you'll notice that a lot of drives will tell you that when they boot up. They'll go SMART enabled, that kind of thing. So there you are. There's the eSATA. Okay, so it's funny they show this picture. So this is an internal hard disk, obviously. And that's how it connects to the board. And that's kind of a review for you guys, right? I love the ones with the little clips. That's great. So you've already done that. It's very easy. That's the data cable, right? Data cable, not the power. Power for hard drives comes from the power supply, does not come from the motherboard, right? The data comes from the board. Anyway, they mentioned eSATA. And really all eSATA is a port that's put on the back of the computer that allows you to connect this. And so eSATA stands for external SATA, and it means that you would have an external place to plug in a SATA drive and connect it externally. Some systems are not super plug and play with that, and so sometimes you unplug an eSATA and it goes, whoops, what the heck's going on? Not as good as USB, but why would you do it? Well, faster. Now, USB has been catching that, right? So you would really have to go out and read some reviews on this is the throughput on this USB 3.2 drive compared to my eSATA, and then you would know how that's working. Thunderbolt, for instance, is super, super fast. Firewire is older, so we don't really use that. I don't talk about that too much. So there's the different standards that they have. And then these, of course, are going to give you the information on, hey, we had SATA revision 1. What was that? Well, that was 8 gigabits. Remember, lower B, so not bytes. 1.5 gigabits in a second is how it could transfer. So, wow, that's a lot. But now we're up to 3. And it's also listed as serial ATA 600 or SATA 600 or SATA 600, and that's 6 gigabits, right? So SATA 3 was first published by SATA 10 in 2009. Most new motherboards today use this standard, or SATA IO, sorry, not SATA 10. Yeah, stop reading it and say what it is. All right, then they talk about how it connects, which we've already looked at. And we looked at that power connector, and we looked at the fact that there's a little tiny, it's like a long L right there, and that goes here, right there. And that's power. The longer one's power, and the shorter one is the data. You got to connect those. Good job. All right, let's see. Anything else I want to mention? Oh, RAID. We might be able to get into RAID. I don't know. It's I don't know if we're gonna have time for it just because we need to be finished with our labs a couple of weeks early because of the not coming back in person after Thanksgiving. So we'll see how that goes, because I have these little RAID cards, and I usually have you put in these RAID cards and then control a bunch of hard drives off of them. RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Devices. There's been so many iterations of what this stands for. It used to stand for a redundant array of inexpensive disks. That's what it was really meaning. Because way back in the day, it was you wanted a ton of hard disk space, but you couldn't. They weren't that big, like if you had like a 200 megabyte drive, right? That was like massive. It was so massive. But what if I need a terabyte of storage? And then I have a bunch of hard drives, right, that I split up. And so RAID provided a way to group them all together. So you could take a bunch of 200 megabyte drives and make a total gigabyte of space. That's what I should have said, not terabyte. So this is going to take a look at some RAID, which is really the next big thing. Actually, let's mention this. You do need to know that on a standard hard disk, right? Standard hard disk, because it's got moving parts. That's what I'm doing there. The most common is 7,200 RPMs, and that is how fast is it spinning those disks around inside. So this RPM is the same RPM you've always known, revolutions per minute. So 7,200 times in a minute. Server drives now go up to like 20,000 RPMs. 15,000 is very common. 10,000, I have a 10,000 RPM drive that I use for backup. And then 72 is more common. And there's even some that are 54s, which are really slow. And sometimes those are used in the low-end notebooks still these days. The idea is if you have data recorded on this disk, right, then we need to spin that disk as fast as we can. So the head can see the information as quickly as possible. So that disk is not going to spin one direction and spin back the other. It's just going to spin one direction constantly. And then the head has to wait for that information to get to where the head is. So that's all programmed in it. So if we speed up the RPMs and we make it a 1500 RPM drive, which is twice as fast, that means we're going to see that data twice in the time that it takes this one. That's the idea. And they're faster. But you also have to realize there's a spin up time, right? It takes longer to get to 10,000 RPMs than it does 7,000. So it also depends on how much data you're reading. There's a bunch of stuff in there. But this is one of the things that influences how fast a drive can access the information. And so when you go out and look at a hard drive and you'll see they're all the same size, say you're looking at a 4 or a 10 terabyte drive these days, you look at that 10 terabyte drive and there's another one next to it and you're like, wow, that's like $40 cheaper. Maybe I should get that one. Well, you want to verify that the RPMs is not lower on your cheaper drive. Because if that's lower, then you may want the more expensive one. Now, moving on, cache sizes and buffer sizes. This is SATA. So interface standards, use standards that the motherboard support. Yeah, SATA. So anyway, cache size or the buffer size, that's also important. So the 10 terabyte drive I have was a little more expensive because it spins at 10,000 and has 128 megabytes of space for cache. Well, what does that really provide for you? Well, the hard drive isn't exactly where it needs to be to write the data that you just click save on. So it can go straight into cache. It'll be held in cache. You think it's done, but it's not. You go on about your business. You're like, wow, that's a fast drive. And then it writes the data to the disk when it needs to, right? That's what cache does for us. It provides a faster operation for a slower device. This, of course, can be as high as they want it to. So the 2 megabyte to 128, you'll see ones for 256 now. Standard is 32 or 64. And so again, if you're looking at a drive and you're like, wow, this is $40 cheaper. Well, look at how fast it's spinning and look at what the cache is. Because the faster it spins and the more cache it has, the faster it'll access the information or write the information. All right. This is about installing. Make sure your work area is clean. Make sure you use, wrist strap. It shows you, this is like, oh, I wish I would have seen this. Would you have paid attention to this, right, before you did the lab? Yeah, these are super nice, right? These are really, really easy. You twist it, you take it off, and you can put the drive in and push it back down, and it puts the two little plastic hinges in there, and it just holds it in place. They're fantastic. If you don't use one of those, then right, you put the screws in. So they're showing you different ways. Like that's a hard disk cage. We didn't have to use anything like that, thank goodness. It's older stuff. We don't have to use anything like this on a hard drive. We will be using a tray, right, for our smaller SSDs to make them fit in this same amount of space, right? You had to do that, but this is like old school. Like I have this super wide bay. We don't really see those anymore. If you're doing that kind of work, you're in India or I don't know where you are. Let's see. Oh yeah, RAID. Look at that. They got that right. Redundant array of inexpensive disks. I'm so excited. You'll see that as all sorts of different things. But also called independent disks. Anyway, why use RAID? Well, RAID is a way to provide what they call fault tolerance. And that's just simply tolerance for any faults that might happen by writing 2 copies of the same information to a different hard drive, right? So I'm going to put the information here on this hard drive, and at the same time, it's going to write it to this one. That way, if this one dies, I still have this one. That really came about because while hard disks are super, super reliable, when you want to deal with this in a server environment, the spinning parts of a computer are going to be the ones that die first. And in a server system, you may have a server installed for 20 years,